I just want to go through a few points, key points that I made. I would teach the poem. The first lines 1 through 4 is a call to celebration about the appropriate and right use of wine, and the right thinking, and suitable moral community of the symposium as part of the symposic lyric context. And then for the next lines up to line 21, they're remarkable for the elision of Marcus Antonius, who's the true loser in the Battle of Actium, and instead focusing on Cleopatra, which is part of Octavian's propaganda to exploit the Orientalist tendencies that he is creating in an East-West divide.
Joe, sorry to interrupt you for a second. There's a little bit something happening with your microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So just if you wouldn't mind staying away from it.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Right.
Okay, so and the Orientalism that I speak of includes things like the dementia of Cleopatra, dementis furorem, her drunkenness, the wrong use of wine in the symposic context. She's ebria, she's mentem lymphatum mariotico. Point 2, the Orientals are sick and filthy. Contaminato cum grege turpium morbo. They're bestial. She's a fatale monstrum, reinforced by a Homeric simile, a capiter velut. And she'll be driven to sobriety and right thinking by the righteous power of Caesar. And then where I've written the word shift around line 21, and then you get this authentically Horatian attribute of his poetry, where he takes a bit of a twist, and yet recovered of her sobriety and senses by fear, she will think and act better, which is to say, she'll act like a Roman and she'll act like a man. She will first take thought of her class, generosius, and you compare that with later on invidens privata deduci. She'll act against her biology, nec muliebriter, nec humilis mulier. She'll demonstrate Roman virtus, or manly courage, compare alsa fortis. She didn't flinch at death in lines 22 and 24, and instead, point 4, she calmly takes in her world as it truly is. Alsa et jacentem visere regiam vultu sereno. And she chooses death maturely, rationally, deliberata morte, and with respect to her dignitas, she's invidens privata. And you'd have to say, with an appropriately Oriental sense of style, alsa fortis et asperas tractare serpentes. And finally, she too demonstrates a perversely decorous bibulousness when she settles for one final appropriate drink, atrum cum biberat venenum. It's not quite the symposic libation Horace urges the Romans to in lines 1 through 4, but it is one so suited to someone so demented and ferocious. So you hardly need me to point out the themes that show to disadvantage issues of gender and gender identity, race, and class. And in the classroom over my lifetime, both as a student and professor, these themes may have raised eyebrows, but too often didn't provoke sufficient comment, and little by way of patient analysis. For most of the past 2 decades, and the greater part of my teaching the Cleopatra Ode has been spent talking about, as Gregson called it, the rhetoric of Horatian lyric discourse, and how, as Bundy called it, the laudator selected topics with which to praise the laudandus, and how Horatian lyric was grounded in an Epicurean sodality or Aristotelian moral framework, virtue ethics. And I'm sure I felt conflicted when confronting questions, my own and my students, the horrifying phrase contaminato cum grege. I would confront it with a feeling or a response of something like internally with, yeah, we really need to address that, but with so much to understand about Horace's Carmina, the grammar and the rhetoric, how exactly am I going to find time to talk about everything? How will I talk about the rest that's important? So this internal conflict, I felt that having so much to teach in terms of those two areas and how to talk about the rest. And by the rest, I think I meant social justice. That's the question that occasions the paper of today. And so I want to talk a little bit about where this feeling of conflict within me came from. And I've identified multiple factors. And I don't think it's so simple as just citing privilege, though I'd never exclude that. But the third part of my paper is to look at some of the changes within the US, within higher education, within my own institution in particular, within our discipline of classics, and within myself. So first off, over the course of that time, and we're quickly moving in even further in that direction, the United States has become a lot more diverse than it was even 10 years ago. The birth rate of non-white babies has now exceeded for the first time in United States history those of white babies. And by the middle of the 30s, 2030s, this will be a majority minority country, period. That's a demographic fact that it would be nearly impossible to undo at this point. Along with those demographic shifts, we've seen geographical shifts of that population, a heightened urbanization, and areas of the country, melting pots from New York, New Jersey, Florida, Texas, and the whole West Coast are growing, and a lot of the rest of the country is emptying. This is occasions symptoms in our political world, where we are finding partisanship that was kindled in the mid-90s and has grown apace ever since, and yielded, I think it's fair to call it dysfunction at the highest levels. And turning my view a little bit to perceptions of higher education, the perception of the value of a higher education has changed a lot as well, and usually for the negative, even while the data would indicate that the value of those educations never been a greater differentiator in terms of people's outcomes. The institution where I teach, Mary Washington, and have been happy to do so for the last 2 decades, has changed a lot as well. We were a predominantly white institution at PWI in the year 2000, and we are still the same thing today, but a lot less so, and that was intentional, a part of a strategic planning device that accords with our values as an institution. As of today, we are now 28% are self-described people of color, 8% Latinx, 7.5% Afro-American, 20% receive Pell aid. We're a lot more diverse than we were 20 years ago. And yet that's, we, like other institutions, also reflect shortcomings or work that we still have to do to get where we're going to need to go if we're to be an equitable institution and helping to produce an equitable Virginia, our primary source of students, and an equitable nation.